Hello and welcome back to online English class honors and regular English 2 students. I hope you guys are doing well. Today we're going to be beginning our work on OTN 3 by conducting an SQ3R to make sure that we understand on a basic level what has happened or what came to pass in the chapters 7 and 8 of part 1, the concluding chapters of the exposition of the narrative. Okay, before we do that, it is the end of the week, and I just want to make sure that we have gotten done all of the things that you need to get done or needed to get done throughout the course of the week. Okay. So obviously at the beginning of this week, Tuesday, you need to send me an email confirming your reading of part 1. Everyone needs to have read part 1 of the narrative. You need to be working on your reading of part 2, chapters 1 through 6. All right, I'm going to need reading check confirmation of that by next Monday. All right, so after the weekend is over. You should have already all sent me confirmation of your completion of OTN 1. All right, and you need to be working on your OTNs as we complete them in class. All right, so just again, they don't need to be written in formal prose. These don't need to be essays because you obviously have another essay out. But while you're listening to lecture, you need to be doing your best, all right, to make a record of the lecture, the conversation that we are having, okay? So OTN 2 needs to be complete, and we are going to begin OTN 3 today. All right, so without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into that process, all right? So OTN 3 is going to analyze chapters 7 and 8 of part 1. First, we are going to conduct our SQ3R, all right, which is going to help us sort of establish a basic understanding of where we've come up to this point in the novel, and also where we're going to be going in chapter 7 and 8. Then on Monday of next week, we're going to be looking at these four key points, all right, that help develop our understanding of the nature of the dystopian setting and also characterize the nature of Winston's rebellion against totalitarian control in preparation for the expansion of his rebellion in part 2. All right, so part 2 is going to act as the kind of rising action of the narrative as Winston begins taking more forceful steps in his rebellion against the party. All right. So what we're going to be looking at is obviously this point, which is about the party's telos. We'll talk about what that word means. We're going to be talking about Winston's summary of intellectual freedom and the significance of that summary. We're going to be talking about Winston's thoughts on the party's treatment of the proles in chapter 8 and chapter 7, and then we're going to be analyzing the significance of one of Winston's last major acts in part 1, which is the purchase of the glass paperweight. Okay, so before we do all that, let's get into our SQ3R. Okay, so I've got my notes in front of me. I've got my novel open to chapter 7, and I want to quickly lay out a kind of surveillance of the text that we have under consideration. All right, so in chapters 7 and 8, obviously who is speaking? Well, it continues to be the third person omniscient narrator. That is a literary device that Orwell uses throughout the narrative in order to convey or frame the narration of Winston Smith's internal thoughts and feelings, okay, who is his protagonist, all right? What is the genre or the style of the text? Well, this is another thing that doesn't change throughout the course of the novel. It's a dystopian fiction. All right, let's talk about how that dystopia has been developed over the course of part 1, all right? Once again, dystopian fiction is a kind of genre of literature that explores the worst possible world. Okay, so up to this point, the dystopian environment, which is governed by the party, all right, so they are kind of the essence of the group that makes this world the worst possible way it could be, has been characterized as a place that governs the external and notably the internal lives of its citizens. When I say internal lives, what I'm referring to is both their minds, okay, their ability to reason, and their hearts, their ability to love and to hate, to adore, to delight in, to sacrifice for, all right, to devote themselves unto, all right. So the party dominates its citizens' notions of reality. That's something that we discussed yesterday in detail when we analyzed the philosophical system of the party. All right. In order to do that, we used this kind of little graphic here. which I talked through yesterday quite a bit. Now, at the end of yesterday's lecture, you might have been saying, that's silly. All right, I understand kind of what you're saying, but what you're saying is silly. Uh, Nobody, that can't happen. That's unrealistic. Nobody thinks that way, and that's never happened. Uh, Incorrect. All right. All throughout the course of world history, authoritarian and totalitarian forms of government have cultivated a philosophical environment in which, all right, their citizens' notions of reality are controlled by them, and that completely reorganizes the way that they understand history or what has come to pass in the past. It completely changes the way that they observe their environment around them, and therefore completely changes the thoughts that they have and what they think it to be true. Let me give you two quick examples: one from the ancient world and one from the modern world. All right. So there once was an ancient empire called the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrian Empire was basically a society, an entire society that was completely consumed with the conquest of the known world. And they were absolutely horrible. All right. They were totally brutal to their enemies. All right. Totally dehumanizing to their enemies. You want to know why? What made those people who were relatively like normal people? Okay. Obviously, they probably had some psychotic leaders. All right. But when it came down to it, most of the Assyrian people, most of the men who marched in the Assyrian army, most of the women and children that were back at home in Assyria waiting for the men who marched in the Assyrian army to come home were like normal people, right? Who ate food and sat down and got married and had children. They weren't a bunch of like monsters. They were humans. All right. So how did the Assyrian Empire, how did the Assyrian government enlist its citizens in believing that what they were doing was like the right thing, or a good thing to do, a worthy thing to spend their time doing? Well, they considered, all right, it to be a universal truth, a metaphysical reality, that the Assyrian race was the master race. They worshipped gods. The gods of Assyria were war gods that basically demanded, all right, that their people, it was true, it was a universal truth that the Assyrian people worship their God by conquering their neighboring countries. It was the way, it was just what it meant to be an Assyrian, okay? And therefore, all of history, which the Assyrians believed centered on, all right, the sort of conquest and cultivation of a worldwide Assyrian empire, okay, that would govern the world for eternity, okay, all of history was oriented around the construction of that empire. Okay, so when an Assyrian individual, according to that metaphysical reality, looked at their environment, it made sense to them. Oh, well, yeah, it does seem like all of our historical documents, all of the ways that people have talked in the past, all of it seems to be about constructing this world empire. Okay, and so when the Assyrians observed their environment, right, and they looked at, say, the women and children that they were massacring, all right, or the men that they were killing in order to expand their empire, they did not see them as human beings that they were incurring suffering on, and that was bad or evil. They viewed them, right, according to the metaphysical realities that they had been trained to believe in. They viewed them as enemies of the eternal kingdom that they were destined to create. And so it was reasonable and true for them to think thoughts like, this individual needs to be killed. All right. Same thing is true. Let me give you a modern example. Same thing was true in the Nazi regime, cultivated by Hitler, right? Who, by the way, Orwell kind of used some of Hitler's tactics in his authoritarian, totalitarian regime to sort of base the party on, along with Joseph Stalin and the USSR. Okay, so what Hitler did is he asserted that it was a universal truth, all right, that the Aryan race was the master race, and it was also a universal truth that Jews were bad. That was real. That was true, right? So all of history, in light of those truths, begin to make more sense, right? All that suffering that we've had in the past, it's because, all right, of the nasty Jews and the nasty racial inferior races taking away the rightful control of the Aryan race. That's obvious. That's a historical reality in light of the metaphysical reality that the Aryans are the master race and the world is better off when we're governing it, and racial other ethnicities are inferior. Okay? So when the German individual observes his environment and he views, all right, a Germany that has been crippled after World War I in the Treaty of Versailles, okay, he sees, according to these metaphysical realities set up for him by the Nazi regime and its leader, its big brother Hitler, right? And in light of the historical reality that has been sort of constructed for that German individual and preached to them by the Nazi party, the German individual, who's just kind of a normal person led by a psychopath, all right, granted, okay, looks at this and thoughts like, well, I guess the Jews need to be exterminated, and I guess we need to invade the Sudetenland, and I guess we need to make war on the British and the French and make sure that we are masters of the entire world, begin to make sense. And any kind of observation that defies that metaphysical reality, like for instance, if a German individual looked at a Jewish individual and said, "Hey, that actually looks like a human being, not like some kind of evil vampire monster, like Nazi propaganda seems to imply," then that observation is simply wrong. Why? Because it does not reflect the metaphysical realities, the universal truths that have been articulated and established for them by their governing structures. The party simply works in the same way. It requires its citizens to base its observations according to the universal truths that are prescribed to them. Winston wants to free his mind from the control of the party who assert control over reality. Much in the same way, he wants to establish freedom in his internal loves and internal hatreds. All right. So, in other words, right, all of the narrative up to this point has sort of established the ways in which the party controls reality, controls the internal lives of its citizens. And this has affected Winston, who is an example of one of the citizens, by sort of illustrating or developing in him these kind of irrational thoughts, these irrational oscillations between contrary emotions. All right, that are reflections of the ways in which the party's domination of his reasoning, domination of his heart, affect him as an individual. He is incapable of rational, linear kinds of thinking. All right, he wants to be free of this. And throughout part one, he is attempting to be free of this. Okay, so what is the title of the text that we're looking at so far? Well, it's going to be part one, chapters 7 and 8. This is going to conclude the introduction of the narrative in preparation for part two. All right, what's our central question? Our central question is, how does the novel's narration in chapters 7 and 8 of part 1 develop our understanding of the dystopian environment and continue to characterize our complex protagonist, Winston Smith? Okay, let's quickly summarize in our remaining minutes here. We don't have much time left. All right, so stick with me. Let's quickly summarize what happens in these chapters. All right, so in chapter 6, Winston had narrated and thought about and written about in his journal his frustrations because he is forbidden to have intimate sexual relations with someone that he finds attraction or attractive, because the party forbids individuals to get married that are actually in love and actually physically attracted to one another. All right, the party in that way forbids a kind of delightful, loving, intimate relationship between two individuals outside of itself. Okay, it wants to dominate delight. Uh, the only thing you can truly, authentically delight in Oceana should be the adoration of Big Brother and obedience to the party. Okay, so Winston is very frustrated by this. He ends the sixth chapter wanting to shout expletives at the top of his voice because of his frustration, and then he turns his attention back to journaling about his hope. The possible way that Big Brother could fall. All right, and the first line of chapter 7 is, "If there is hope, it lies in the proles." Okay, so this introduces us to another group of people in Oceana society called the proles. Right, and basically what Oceana society looks like is Big Brother's at the top. Then beneath Big Brother are what is called a small group of people called the inner party. All right, that's like O'Brien. Beneath them is the kind of quote unquote middle class of Oceana society, the outer party, of which Winston and Julia are members. And then there is the working class, the kind of peasant class, the third estate, if you will, of Oceana society, and they're called the proles, okay, which is a shortened term for Marx's proletariat. All right. Now, basically, Winston believes that if Big Brother is going to fall ever, it would have to be because the proles, of which there are millions, rebelled against the government. They're the only group of individuals who could possibly alter the situation in Oceana if they just simply banded together and overran the government completely. All right, it would obviously cost hundreds of thousands of lives and maybe millions, but it could possibly change things. Okay, so if there is any kind of rational hope, okay, remember the definition of hope, what it means to hope for something reasonably, then it has to lie with the proles. But all right, in order for the proles to rebel, Winston thinks, okay, and I'd like for you to think about this as well, they would need to be conscious that their world is not as it ought to be. All right? And if they are going to be conscious of the fact that their world could be better or is not the way that it ought to be, it would require them to think critically about abstractions like equality and justice and that which is good. The proles are denied education. They are denied the opportunity to consider what a better world would look like. They are denied the opportunity to know history and think about different ways or meditate on different ways of structuring a society. And so, therefore, because they will never be conscious of the ways in which their world is not as it ought to be, they will never risk their life to make it the way that it ought to be. Okay? In other words, as Winston writes, until the proles become conscious, they will never rebel, and until after they have rebelled, they cannot become conscious. In other words, the proletariat or the proles' rebellion is stopped because they are denied education. All right. Winston continues to meditate on the way the party controls the proles by keeping them in both desperately tired and overworked constantly, in constant material need, and also significantly uneducated or undereducated. They do not ever have the opportunity to think of issues like justice or what it would mean for a society to be constructed in a quote unquote good way. All they think about is their material needs. And in that sense, they are dehumanized by the government that is supposed to be protecting their rights and protecting their flourishing. All right. So Winston then begins to question whether or not life was actually better before the party had control. All right. Whether or not life was genuinely life is worse now under the party's control, because if it wasn't genuinely better earlier, if it wasn't genuinely different earlier, then obviously rebelling against the party doesn't make sense. Okay, they are an immutable reality. Okay, it cannot change. So Obviously, Winston can't crack open a history book like we can. He can't open up a documentary of a past time. Okay, all of those are useless. All he has is his memory, but he does think about one time where he held documentary evidence of the party's lies. It was proof, okay, and it was a photograph of three early leaders of the party: Jones, Arison, and Rutherford, all of whom were traitors to Big Brother, or at least confessed that they were traitors to Big Brother, as Big Brother was consolidating his power and making sure that he didn't share it with anyone, including these early figures, Jones, Aaron, and Rutherford. And Winston held a picture of those men in a place where they had officially confessed that they were not, all right, and he held a picture dated, all right, with their names on it and their faces on it, that proved that they were not where the party said they were, where the party's records say they were. In other words, the party's version of history is not true. They are not in control of truth. Okay? Now that document needed to be destroyed. All right, it should have been destroyed, and Winston has to destroy it because if he were found with it, it would obviously be thought crime. Okay, but that proof, okay, gives Winston hope, okay, because it illustrates, very much like his journal, if it survives, will illustrate that it is possible to think thoughts that defy the party's control of quote unquote reality. All right, he concludes that the party ultimately requires its citizens to reject the evidence of their eyes. Okay, in other words, reasoning, like I explained yesterday, is illegal in Oceania. As Symes says, orthodoxy, which is to say pure obedience to the party, pure political orthodoxy is unconsciousness in Oceania. Okay, which is one of the reasons why Winston's rebellion, a conscious act of self-analysis, is so significant. And then this leads Winston to ask another very important philosophical question that he should not be allowed and should not ask in Oceania, and that is, why do they do what they are doing? What is their goal? The philosophical term for this is, what is the telos? What is the end goal? What is the point of all that they are doing? He understands how, all right, they accomplish what they are doing. He understands doublethink. He understands how the mutability of the past. He understands how newspeak narrows the range of thought. He understands how the party keeps the proles under control, but he does not understand why they are doing that. Okay. All right, finally, in Chapter 8, Winston continues to pursue an answer to this question he was asking earlier in Chapter 7, which was life better or different before? Okay, he can't, once again, he can't appeal to a kind of textbook. He can't appeal to history, and he can't ask his school teacher. So what does he do? He goes and just finds the oldest guy he can find, an old prole who might remember a better time, and he has this conversation that is incredibly frustrating with this prole, that illustrates the ways in which the party has dehumanized this individual, because the prole is incapable of responding to Winston according to abstract concepts like justice, equity, a good society. All he can remember is his material experiences. Okay. And Winston walks away very discouraged because he recognizes the extent to which the proles have been denied access to the very basic human behavior of attempting to construct an understanding of that which is good and to pursue a society that reflects that definition. All right. Then Winston walks to a secondhand store, all right, which is just like a consignment shop. He goes to Goodwill and he buys a clear glass paperweight, okay, which he thinks is very beautiful. He calls it a beautiful thing. Okay, this is another kind of act. This is an external rebellion that's also an act of thought crime. Okay, very similar to buying the journal and writing in the journal. Buying this, quote, beautiful paperweight that is good for nothing except for the fact that it is beautiful is an example. of Winston's continued and amped up rebellion. All right, he meets a guy named Mr. Charrington, and Mr. Charrington takes him upstairs to a room where there is apparently no telescreen, where he can be alone. All right, this leads us into part 2, where Winston is going to raise the stakes of his rebellion. All right, we'll be talking and analyzing these pieces of text closely in our class on Monday. Hope you guys have an excellent weekend.